It's my personal belief that customers accept that things will go wrong. Your flight will be delayed, your room might not be ready, product gets delivered, it's broken already, et cetera, et cetera. That's just the way of the world. It is how the brand delivers against that. And I think, and we've all heard those wonderful examples of how a brand rose to the occasion when something really goes wrong. It's a moment of truth. And I feel like those are also very much overlooked. When you can rise to the occasion and really correct things in the right way with the right level of personality, you will actually gain far more loyalty than maybe if it never happened at all.
A great welcome to our guest speaker today, who is Donald Chesnut. And thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me. Looking forward to this.
Super. And Alex, great to see you as always. You're always wearing the swanky blazer. So I'm the hoodie, you're in the blazer. So we're going to have to talk about that, right?
Well, I do this especially for you, and especially for Donald. I mean, this is a momentous occasion here.
Super. Okay.
And I'm just in the t-shirt, guys. So
here
I rank in that spectrum.
That's perfect.
Super. Well, look, today's session's all about the secrets of customer experience. We're joined today with a really special guest. So Donald has a number of decades experience. First started in Sapient, 20 years there, really advising a lot of what we consider the digital first brands in terms of the experience. So he has a rich tapestry of knowledge and insight, presenting creative ideas. He was noted as Adweek's in the Creative 100 and digital 40 over 40. So I'm the secret's out, Donald. You're not 21, so and you're also a wonderful acclaimed author as well, and the 101 or UX for Dummies, as they call it.
Yep.
And certainly 30 CX executives to watch, and so begins the list. You're a very acclaimed individual, being the first chief customer officer of General Motors at a really interesting time in terms of going digital experiences, whole advent of electric, and then before that, Mastercard. And I'm sure people have read your acclaimed article on the Wall Street Journal, thinking about how Netflix is an experience rather than what I tend to do. I am into binging, but I certainly appreciate the experience as well. So you're very welcome, Donald. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Really, really good to be here. Looking forward to this session.
Superb. So I'm going to start off. We had a fantastic conversation, Donald, just about how we frame today's session, which is all about the unknown or overlooked secrets of customer experience. And the interesting kind of segue that we took was the metaphor of theater and how theater can really provide a new paradigm in terms of thinking about creating new stories, new experiences, new narratives for customers. And certainly there's actually, when I started looking into it, MIT have a wealth of information about this idea of emotional arcs in narrative. And I would just love to kind of start there. And then I think you have a lovely intersection with trust. So how, when you, it's not necessarily about building trust, it's how you create those moments for the rebuild and how that creates long-term loyalty. So hopefully that's a nice jump off point. And Alex will join in with shaping the conversation through questions as well and reflections.
It's perfect. I'll start at least this conversation with, my journey. I studied dramatic literature, the study of theater, but mostly as literature, maybe as a frustrated actor in the younger years, but nonetheless, I was always really passionate, still am today. I love to travel, love to go to theater. And one of the things that I realized not till later in life is the parallel between experience, I think user experience, employee experience, customer experience in theater. Let me start there. Is for one, experience is, and I think we oftentimes think about the channel. Oh, it's a retail experience, it's the store, it's user experience, it's what you're designing, your mobile at the screen or the website or whatever else it might be. And now it's taken all different forms. we use the focus on what we're building really as to talk about but the experience is something that the customer's having. And two people can go in, I'll use this analogy, you can go into the same store and buy the same product. So the journey is technically the same, but can come out with vastly different experiences, depending on what they were thinking about, how they felt, whatever, et cetera. So, first understanding that the medium, I guess, I'll use that word for experience, is the actual person. It's a very human feeling. And yes, we think about interaction design, all these things, the technology to achieve whatever the business goal, but what we're enabling is the experience. We're not actually designing so we're hoping for the best outcomes, but having that orientation and at least understanding enough about your customers to identify what are the emotions you want to elicit. When and not every experience should be an emotional one. Sometimes you want to get in and out of a store or have a micro experience, a payment, and not think about it. Have that thinking fast and slow moment and have it just be on autopilot. But where you do want to really be front of mind and experience, just making sure it's the right ones. To get to where I started thinking about the parallel with theater is, it's very interesting as we think about today, everyone watches some form of entertainment or sports for that matter. It can be short form digital, can be long form digital, screen, or it can be actually in person. But I've always still love going to the movies in a theater, actual theater. It's a different experience when you're all there together, And for live theater, for those people that do, it's probably much like a sporting match. What goes on in here or in here, both, is that feeling. There's a tension and a real experience that is really augmented, accelerated when it's live. And those two things I suddenly realized wasn't forethought or foresight, but are really very similar. How you're trying and what a group, again, sitting with people that are going through, at least watching the same thing, they might have slightly different reactions, to my point, but it's an emotional feeling, it's a cognitive feeling, et cetera. And there are parallels there. So I'll just take it a couple steps further and see how it resonates with you both. But then there is the whole idea of narrative story. And we think of brand. And in today's world, when the discussion is so much around technology, as we have multiple mediums, and then we think even AI, it's all, but just, there's a story that goes on. There's a story in every football match, but there's a story in every piece of theater or movie, comedy, tragedy. Maybe it's a mix of both. The same thing, maybe, between what a customer goes through in their journey. And not at the same level. It's a business relationship, but thinking about the highs, the lows, and we can unpack that a little bit further. And at its core, you want a brand to really have a story. So thinking through how are we orchestrating the good, the bad, and what we want to do as a business. So there are, I think, far more parallels, I've said it a couple times, than I ever thought in my many years ago, around understanding the power of story and the power of experience. So for one's from the business and what's going out, but the other is from the actual person, the human that we're working to elicit reactions. And then, I'll unpack that perhaps a little bit further, but I'll take a pause there. And I feel like that is not always maybe 10 years ago, we talked a lot around the convergence of storytelling, communications, and systems. I don't hear it as much today. And I feel like there's a bigger opportunity, particularly as the technology is such a different set of ingredients, to maybe take it a little further. But does that resonate with you both? But that's kind of Chris, in our brief chat and talking about this, that all right.
I saw Alex nod in agreement there. And I think what I'd love to do is to anchor that first idea, which is, experiences happen. You're not necessarily in control of the experience. And, you operate in the design world, and it's this idea of being able to control or design experiences. experiences happen. And I know that's a core idea from Alex. So I'd love to bring Alex just to tease that out further before we then drop into this whole narrative and theater of.
Brilliant.
So I don't know if you noticed, Donald, I was smiling. I had a big grin on my face the whole time you were talking, because I'll tell you why. Because we have a complete meeting of the minds, and I'll tell you, I did write a book. I've been thinking about this a long time, and it's called "Forget the Customer, See the Person." And one of the key chapters is called "You Cannot Design an Experience." You can't design an experience, and it's like. I mean, it's like I listened to you before that, right? In terms of, and it comes from my psychology training, and my point was exactly like yours, which is a customer experience is an emotion. It's an emotional state. You can influence it, you can try to influence it, but you cannot create it. And it's a very, it's a preposterous idea, and it's an idea that really, I think only people like you that have a real understanding of humans can understand. Unfortunately, so many leaders nowadays come from technology and from operations, and they kind of, a lot of them just parrot that, let's create a great experience, right? And without having this deep understanding of what experience is, because that has implications on then, if you have this arrogance that if we create this, we're going to have a great experience, then you're most likely not going to have it. And I love the thinking in terms of metaphors. And again, leaders like you are very rare nowadays that think about humans and think in terms of metaphors, not just go to the technology and to the solutions right away.
Alex, I love it. I love your reaction alone. I hope you saw me nodding as well. But Chris, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was thinking, okay, we've now set the stage metaphorically. So as you think about experienced professionals who are, if we're to tease out this metaphor around the setting the stage and thinking about how we think about design, creating the environment for the experience to happen. Do you want to then kind of link that to then, your viewpoint around the narrative, and let's go in a bit deeper on the parallel that we've struck there.
Brilliant. And I'll want to say one thing is I want to give credit to two former colleagues of mine, Todd Cherkowski and John Kane, brilliant people that helped change my thinking in really understanding the human experience. And they come from multitude of backgrounds, but over those, I don't know, 20, 30 years that you're talking about in the beginning, Chris, coming from a background in ethnography, really unpacked my notion of, no, it's really, these are people we're designing for, and we get caught up. But so kudos to them. And they helped me first understand, like, you don't own the experience. No one does. And what I love also there is it's the same thing with brands. You can design for any brand, but truthfully, the customer owns what is the brand. There's that expression, the experience is the brand, but the brand occurs here. And what I think of, pick a brand, NatWest, pick a brand, Amazon, it lives and dies, and inside my head by way of my experiences with it. So a couple things I'll say really to get to design and make it more tangible is there's one thing I've seen, I don't know, 15 years that one design technique, and I guess it may have a parallel in theater, but I don't want to push that, I don't want to force the metaphor entirely, but trying to think through what are the principles for the experience that we want to bring to life. And I'll start to use the word brand. So brand is oftentimes used, by business folks and technology folks as the look and feel. And sure, maybe it's the tone of the content, but the brand as the experience is a really interesting territory. And this notion of, I've seen so many design teams worked with them side by side, or where we talk about experience principles, but I feel like that exercise is done at the start of a project, product, program, and then kicked aside. And the real challenge I feel is thinking about that exercise and how do we use those? So what are the principles for whatever experience we want to build? And yes, there's always, as I said, an interesting exercise of trying to put that into words that will enable the experience, et cetera. And one thing, Kristen, talking to you, it's just a few weeks ago, is a forerunner to this conversation. Is it just occurred to me how much I have seen that once and never seen it picked up later on. Very hard, and so it is maybe a thought in how, because that's the narrative, that's the how do you bring to life the branded experience in some form that will make it distinct, potentially and hopefully unique, in the good and the bad, etc. But it's Alex, I'd love maybe your thoughts around that. But holding true to that throughout the product evolution process, even if you're just designing something or one part, one feature throughout the process, but even holding that all the way through as a product lives and there's new features added in the product backlog. I don't see that held to, and I feel like there's a big opportunity there to stick to what and continue to evolve those, because that's the experience. Those are the tenets for the experience that we want to create. But Alex is and Christopher, that makes sense by way of at least getting a little bit more tangible, and then I have a couple of other ideas as well.
Oh, Donald, I think that makes absolutely perfect sense to me, and I can tell you, I'm thinking also in terms of principles, and one really founding or fundamental principle that I've used from my background is to think of the brand or company or product and customer interaction as a person-to-person interaction. If you take that view, and it is a view, a worldview, right? If you take that and you say, what if the brand was a person, right? Because that goes into trust, and I think that underlies what you're saying. I'm just rephrasing it. If you take that and you say, we're going to carry this throughout, then you're going to see magical things. I can tell you a very brief story about my work at TurboTax at Intuit. And TurboTax, they're one of the biggest innovation after putting the form online, right? Digitizing the tax form, was what's called an interview, which is they try to emulate an interview like a tax person is interviewing you, is talking to you. And it was great innovation. But then at some point it dawned on me to say, what if TurboTax was a person? And I had this brief exercise. I had a really great tax professional talk to a client, right? And go back and forth. And then I said, well, now I'll look at the TurboTax screen and just read off of what's on the screen. And guess what happened? I mean, you take an easy step-by-step program that sounded moronic, right? As a person. Right? Because it started by saying address, right? And then you're like, okay, like if a person did that to you, but it's just this little thing that then can open eyes and right? I mean, if you can do the same thing, what if this car was a person, right? How is it treating your brand and so? So that I'm just saying in support of what you're saying.
I love that you said that. I love that you use those examples. So, and particularly in the form of any product, but as we're talking about conversational and AI driven related products, that analogy of what if this product was a person, how would it behave? I remember, and I've used this example a few years ago, and I'll be a little, and then just recently as a Publicis, kind of, if folks have read about Marcel, the AI-enabled assistant that has really helped revolutionize Publicis organizations across all its entities. It helps experts connect with other experts, et cetera. Now they're opening it to clients. It's really, and I was involved in the early stages of that. So as you're thinking about designing an assistant, that exercise of what if this was a person, and to help all of the stakeholders, what celebrity would this be like? Because then you're coming with a common knowledge of, is it more like X or is it more like this person? And suddenly the attributes, the character of what you're building dependent on, and I name names around kind of whether it's a Scarlett Johansson or Sterling Brown, et cetera. Like, how do you think about what these well-known or relatively well-known people are? And do you want it to speak and behave, et cetera, similar? Not unlike, actually, today's controversy around her, Scarlett Johansson, and the voice of, and that's just a voice. But that voice alone gives so much character for, it's a character that can go back to maybe the theater metaphor. Same thing. So we did some similar work at GM around assistants and trying to think through, these are intelligent assistants, what is potentially a celebrity without actually, you're not trying to design the celebrity, you're just trying to give meaning to something that sometimes doesn't have a visual or sometimes does have a visual representation. But again, that exercise, and it goes back to the same thing that I was talking about around the principles for the experience. And again, how do we stay true to the what we're trying to enable that is happening from on the user's end? Super rich territory.
You know, Donald, just to add one thing, I think what you're talking about is something very revolutionary. What you're talking about is creating a persona for the product, service, or brand. Nobody's talking about that. No, listen, everybody's talking about persona. First of all, it's highly misunderstood, but everybody's talking about persona of the customer. But you're talking about the persona for, and then imagine if those two match up, you know?
Absolutely. And if brands are meant to be experienced, lots of great work I've seen many places around what a brand wants to stand for by way of the strategy, et cetera. But if you're really thinking about the brands are enabled to be experienced today, and they live, if you go back to some of those principles, they live within the customer, then you really need to think about how they come to life. And that exercise alone around, is it a person, and what kind of person, and how would it behave, and all of those things gets the creative juices, but it also helps us stay true to whatever it is that we're designing and help us take a direction.
Super. And I think if we're to think about principles, and I'm thinking about the practicalities, right? That exercise right there, I can see that people can relate that straight away, because that gives the idea that an experience has a personality. And I'm just wondering, could you then say, okay, you've defined the personality, what is the next step, or where do you go from there in terms of building? And what I'd be interested in, is there foundational principles versus how do you kind of anchor the tactics or the strategy to actually think about building that out? So we'd love to hear, you know, one or two more kind of nuggets.
Yeah.
They're the secrets, right? You've unveiled our second, so we're on to our third here, Donald. So appreciate that.
Perfect. So I don't know if they're secrets, because I feel like all the great people that I've worked with, I collect things. So I'll credit everybody, and that's so by way of where you're teeing up the conversation. How else does this come to life? And one of, I think, the overlooked and under-leveraged territories is, it's easy when you're designing a product or a set of features in an existing product that's going to roll out, to think about what it will feel like, what it will do, hopefully how it will be experienced, but sometimes where the rubber hits the road or when it doesn't work. And again, so I'll be more specific. Sometimes error messages, and this sounds so tactical and executional, but if we want to create something that really does have the right level of personality, how are you handling error messages? Interesting work. GM kind of, a lot of it was very systems and functional, and the team there is working on kind of is it coherent? Does it make sense? Does it have a little bit of personality? Because those are the moments that I think an experience goes from, it's the thinking fast and slow, almost subconscious. I'm doing something, I just need to do it, to suddenly something's not working, and it goes to front of mind. So how do you want that to come across? The same thing with onboarding, and the same thing when something goes wrong with a brand. So I'll take that to another level. I think there's some great research. I've seen quotes where, a bad experience with a brand, you need to have roughly 9 or 10 different good experiences to overcome that bad experience. So, and I firmly believe that. And whether it's 9, 10, or 12 or 8, doesn't matter. Like when a brand fails, and it's my personal belief that customers accept that things will go wrong. Your flight will be delayed, your room might not be ready, product gets delivered, it's broken already, et cetera, et cetera. That's just the way of the world. And I think customers, it is how the brand delivers against that. And I think, and I've heard so many stories sitting in meetings with different stakeholders who have those wonderful examples of how a brand rose to the occasion. And that is where, again, it's almost like the thinking fast and slow. I'm just doing something, ordering a product, et cetera. But when something really goes wrong, it's a moment of truth. And I feel like those are also very much overlooked in running a business. Again, when you can rise to the occasion and really correct things in the right way with the right level of personality, I think a brand will actually gain far more loyalty than maybe if it never happened at all. There are great examples of what Chewy did to customers and how they overcame things. Same thing I learned at General Motors, kind of the treating customers, because things will go wrong, but in the right reach out, you've earned an even stronger relationship. So these are I think, I say secrets or unforgotten, is really thinking through the unhappy paths. And it can be as tactical as error messaging, but there's an opportunity for brand, personality, clarity, et cetera, that where a customer goes from, almost subconscious to actual front of mind, to at the macro level, I've got a product, it doesn't work, or I need to go back to my, whatever it might be and whatever the business and brand is, to really, nobody thinks about those things. We don't think about those things until we have to. We're so focused on building the happy path that a little bit of thinking around the unhappy path is so important. But I feel like the way of doing business today is we kind of get ready, launch something, and then we work through the unhappy path because it will come. But I'll pause there, and I'd be curious of what some of the reactions are from both of you. But kind of it's a learning that I have had, I think, for the last 15 or 20 years. That's a huge opportunity.
I'll invite Alex, but I would like to really tease that out a bit more, to think about, well, what are the ingredients that come into that? Because it strikes me that there's culture, organizational culture, there's the servant leadership approach that comes from the organization top in terms of how they react, and then it's designing for the 80%, right? You don't know what's going to go wrong in terms of some of the things that do happen. So I would love to actually then kind of think about, well, what are the ingredients that kind of help us kind of dissect this unhappy experience? And maybe Alex, from a kind of design thinking perspective, is there things that resonate with you in terms of how you would punch that out, or even, Zappos from a cultural perspective, the permission to give employees to speak willingly to the customers and to create that servant leadership? Maybe you could add to what we've heard from Donald.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, I think, Donald, what you're talking about is really, really, really insightful. I mean, thinking about, really, I mean, that's life. Life is ups and downs. It's positive and negative. It's that yin and yang. That's what life is. So you cannot just expect things to go great. And I think, I mean, the ingredients are this. It's the company culture, which is essentially the people. So when Tony Hsieh started Zappos, he basically said, we're going to invest in great employees, nice people, and great customer service, right? And so when you do that, then you earn the trust, and then you build loyalty, which is, again, loyalty is not a program, loyalty is a feeling. And when you really earn it, then you have this feeling in the bank, right? And then you're gonna screw up several times, right? And you still have this goodwill until it runs out. But so that's leading up to that. And then when something goes wrong, you're absolutely right. It's the error messages are a great example of again, interpersonal interaction. So do you tell someone you did something wrong, bad Donald, you clicked on the wrong button, right? versus I'm sorry. We are sorry because we put the wrong label on the button, right? And that goes back to the parallel of Zappos customer services. In our research, the two main ingredients of the great feeling was two very simple things. One is to say I'm sorry and own the, you don't blame UPS, you don't blame anyone else. I'm sorry and I'll fix it for you. These two things.
There's real power in that accountability and taking accountability. Alex, I'll be a little more specific. I think one of the examples that helped form this thinking for me, but at my time at GM, is the recall experience. And having a vehicle and having something wrong and having a recall, I firmly believe that as long as we have vehicles on the road and knowing how important safety is and how complicated they are, whether it's software, hardware, et cetera, there will probably always be recalls out in the market of things. It's just a part of the mobility experience itself. How you deal with the customer experience in that overall part of the interaction, arguably it is not a happy path. It is. And one of the things we aim to do and started doing is we focused on that. Was one of the like, okay, how do we, it's hopefully not a large percent of your customer base that is experiencing that, but they happen. So we really started focusing on what can we do to improve that experience. And one of the things came up is, what is increasingly more important that comes with the vehicle is also the mobile app. And how do we use the mobile app as a vehicle, no pun intended, for communication? So we had made great strides in giving updates, even when there was no update. Airlines have learned that many years ago from an operational standpoint, kind of is sharing what they know as quickly as they know it. And even when they don't know something, it's still frustrating, but they will share. But the more we can keep the more we could keep customers updated by this channel, and the more we could make sure that customers were enrolled, because they would get push notifications of exactly whether we had a status or not a status, and when things were ready to actually be brought into the dealer. It's what we saw with the data that we had, incredible improvement in NPS for once we started actually sharing that. And that's a great example of unhappy paths that are just part of business. And I can call out an airline or a hotel or an e-commerce when something goes wrong, and hopefully taking responsibility in the right tone and being able to share what you can share. It also requires, though, and I think, Chris, this goes to your question, enabling the teams and working with the other stakeholders to push. Like, customers want to know the status, and sometimes technology folks don't want to talk about what the status is because we don't yet know. And being able to push the rest of the organization on that is that it's really important to keep customers updated, not necessarily just go by the old playbooks that we had in the past. There's one other thing that I'll call out is trusting your employees in this. And I know one of the themes of this whole discussion is trust. And trust is a core part of any customer experience with a brand, but it's really with the employees themselves. I spent a lot of time working with our, at GM, fantastic advisors who are fielding calls, particularly sometimes in cases of unhappy interactions, of recalls and things, but enabling them and really enabling them to share what they can and giving them the right scripts, as well as offloading some of those things. If there's no news is an update. At least share that through automated and offloading some of those things, so they can spend time on. But I think that level of trust, even in an unhappy experience, begins with getting your internal folks all oriented around how important this is. And what do we want to be as a brand, going back to the experience principles?
Just to chime in on that, Donald, I think it's so, this is a great example of recall, right? And coming again from your background in theater and in communication, essentially, right? I think that, right? How easy it is to just reframe something in a more positive way and just in more transparent way. So you can frame recall as, look, the government mandates that we, which how's that gonna go along, versus We notice this, and you just, like you said, like things go wrong. Like we have the best technology, but technology is complicated and right? So things would happen, and people would be like, "Oh yeah, that rings true." And then we are proactively fixing it for you, for your safety versus, we by law, I mean, look at the communications. It's just like legalese looking like a contract, and that's scary in itself. It's like,
Hmm.
damn, like what is that, right? But if you turn it around and make it the communication more human and more
Hmm.
empathetic, and then that can go a long way. I'm preaching to the choir.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Give you, Chris, you going to say something?
No,
Yeah.
no, I'll maybe just pause, but my
Yep.
my only thought was, whether there was an additional layer there, Donald, from a user experience point of view, and this idea of acts of courtesy, and what are some of the steps as you're designing out that recall experience that you could think about the journey, and it's whether this naturally brings us into thinking about those breakpoints in customer journey, and just to kind of illustrate that in a bit more, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I think I'll bring it to another industry and another set of user experiences. And I think the world of payments, credit cards, spent time at American Express and Mastercard, and Alex, your comments just a minute ago made me think fraud and payment decline. So that is, I have personally felt from a card, debit, prepaid, credit, paying for something and having your card decline is probably one of the worst customer experience there is, and we've all encountered it. There may be good reasons for the card to be declined, but there's an element, I think, of shame that goes on potentially. Like, why is my card? Oh, it's not me. It's not it's the card and thing. A lot of times that can be for your benefit as the customer. It can be for fraud protection,
Right.
and the rules that determine that, not always the network. It might be the issuing bank. It could be the merchant. It could be a lot of reasons, but kind of understanding is there suspicious activity and things, and trying to do right by the customer, but also what is right on the brand. Very tricky. And there's a complex set of rules and a lot of money involved around kind of if there is whatever, lots of reasons if the transaction is approved and shouldn't have been in the first place. I think the recovery. So I personally had an example: fraud. A card was taken. I didn't even know it was taken and used. And I will say how that card company reached out. It was American Express. Reached out and then reached out afterwards. Again, it was a wonderful example of recovery in the right way and using all channels in language that I could understand, and follow up investigations. But I will say they're also kind of protecting their own. Someone got the card and kind of used it without my authorization. It built trust, more trust, and again, I feel like I am more loyal in that case, to the card brand because of their watchouts, and it was also an inconvenience. So it was one of those things around kind of part of a necessary part of that journey itself, and kind of how you deal with the delicate things, and are you succeeding in that and building loyalty and building that trust in a stronger way, because that is something slow and steady wins the race, but kind of the overcoming kind of the issue that's there. But
I
Alex
love
would be cute. Yeah.
I love that because, and I'm actually just going to build on that story. We did a piece of research looking at high street bank retailers, and essentially we were thinking about fraud was coming up, a lot of anger was being expressed, and essentially customers were being put in the same channel as a normal customer service issue. And
Mm-hmm.
as a result, most people go to Twitter, right? So if you're not getting a response on the phone, you'll go to Twitter. And what actually was happening was, if you go on holidays, back in the day, you had to notify your bank you were going outside so they could unmark your
Mm-hmm.
call. What was happening was the phone lines were taking so long that it was costing quite a lot of money because they're on holidays. They then go to Twitter, reveal their fraud status, and the fraudsters were actually coming in with a better digital experience, sending to them to a landing page, and then they were becoming a victim again of the fraud. So it's this idea of understanding, to your point, that these journeys happen. They're not always equal, right? If you have a normal forgot password experience versus a different emotional state when you've experienced fraud. So it's quite interesting how you can actually design for those two different experiences and then meet the customer at their emotional friction point with the experience.
And Chris,
Love that point.
Just to add to this, and I think you're way too humble, and you're not going to mention that, but I want to highlight that. I mean, a door board, right? This is your bread and butter is to. And speaking of, I mean, tactical things that are very important. And to Don's point about feeling angry or feeling ashamed, you need to unpack the reasons behind that. So you have very negative, strong negative sentiment. But then what are the root causes? Because it's different. If it's shame, you need to do something. If it's anger, why? If it's anxiety, uncertainty, whatnot. But then you say, okay, a lot of these things happen in public, right? You're on a date, and then it's like, and then the person is, I'm sorry, but you're carrying, and everybody's hearing, and then you feel like I'm a loser. Right, so that's when you unpack that, and that's what really a door board does brilliantly, is unpack the root causes, then you can start fixing things.
So
Brilliant. You made it really real. Sorry, but that like, on a date, sometimes at the table, now that they bring the point of sale machine right at and there's nothing in understanding kind of that experience, kind of going back to what that does. Chris, what were you going to say?
yeah, I think what's interesting, our first one of our earlier podcasts, they talk about that trust is the differentiator because the expectation of experience is pretty low, and trust in institutions and everything else is pretty low. So anyone that goes above the standard experience, is differentiated. And I'm just wondering, is this really the key focus point? Focusing on what happens when the experience becomes broken or unstuck or unhappy customers, and is that really the pathway for long-term loyalty, to reduce churn, and to think about that as a strategy that is underserviced, underlooked, and then thinking about, well, how do we, your first 90 days as a chief customer officer, how do you then start to bring this into the real world in terms of steps that you could take to bring this alive?
So you kind of asked the question, is this like a founding approach? Absolutely.
Yes.
I think absolutely.
Yes.
So I think it is easy in any business, any brand. I spent years at an agency working with companies and on the other companies that I've worked at. There's always a backlog of things we want to build and put out there on any product from any business, the new stuff. There needs to be significant effort on what happens when it doesn't go wrong, because I think there's a table stakes aspect of trust. If I'm working with a brand that I've decided to trust, just that it's going to work well, it's when those moments of surprise and shock, it's more about shock, something doesn't go right, and how you recover that. Again, that's where loyalty is. It's never cemented, but if you can recover. And in the example that I gave, and getting a push notification from Amex about a warning of fraud and then a follow-up call. And then I'll give another example. As I went to another bank, once I realized the cards were no longer in my wallet, but I had my wallet, I was able to go to another bank, Chase, in the mobile app, and then because I realized I had to, and immediately block those two cards within seconds. I went to find the customer service, and that was trust. It was like, oh, they actually made it so easy. So there was, and then I got a fraud alert that someone tried to use the card. That's thinking that's, I'm sure, has been built over years of, addressing fraud, putting the features in the hand of the customers. But I feel better about working with those two brands and having them in my wallet because they're looking out for me. It's the same thing for e-commerce when a product has been sent incorrectly or is broken, and how you address it. And again, the companies that I've worked at and worked with, there is always that backlog of new stuff, but making sure you're spending enough, it's all relative, time in the right level of making things right. The error messages was where we started, super tactical. The features that block cards, the recovery, goodwill, recalls, etc., is where you'll earn customers, I think, hopefully for life. And that is kind of one of the themes that I have, because that is also, I'll go back to the theater metaphor. That's when your emotions are really heightened, and if you can rise to that and address it in calm, it is just it's exactly what every brand wants, and it's not always focused on and prioritized as high as just the new stuff.
And just to, I want to highlight two things that you mentioned. You mentioned them in passing, but they're really fundamental and they're brilliant. Two things. They're looking out for me and making things right. These two things, and it's this balance between looking out for the business interest and the customer. And I don't know if you've come across this. There's a HBR article. They quote the Dalai Lama, out of all people, who advocates for, he calls it, well, he says everybody is motivated by self-interest. That's nature. That's nature. But he says we need wise self-interest, because there's self-interest that takes into account the other person's interest. He calls it wise self-interest. But to me, that's the underpinning of trust. And in terms of measuring trust, for example, over the years, I've came across, Fred Reichheld mentioned it years ago at a conference. That's at least my recollection, his measure of trust. And the statement is, the company always has my best interest as a customer in mind. That I think simple and brilliant. And then agree, disagree. And then you can calculate net trust, but this is, to me, you can ask the question, and I want to hear your thoughts about how you measure this, because we need to measure it. You can say I trust the company, right? But that's a slightly different angle to say they're looking out for me.
So I think two things, and I love that you quoted Fred Reichheld, kind of, because I firmly believe in how he thinks. Growth of a business is earned growth, and it's earned by customer trust. So unpacking that all the way, and kind of, it is much easier to keep a customer and expand that relationship than it is to win a new one. But how you do that, I think, how you measure it, I probably have, I think, two answers. There's at the highest macro level, and there's at the interaction level. So it is understanding when things go wrong, you measure that. And kind of the work and the teams that are doing great work at General Motors, looking at the journey at every step and having more data than we've ever had, is understanding how well was the brand there for me. That alone is a great measure of trust when things go wrong. And then there's the macro level of, there's not a better metric than NPS. And I know I've seen on LinkedIn and other forums, it can be very polarizing, but the notion of, was your experience good enough, the macro level, working with this brand, having this card in your wallet, having that car in your driveway, is your experience overall good enough that you would recommend it to someone that you care about, a friend or family member? That alone is a measure of potential growth and trust. And you can take that same metric and ask the same question based on your experience with fraud, with room that wasn't ready in the hotel that you arrived at the experience level, or in a system, based on how well it, would you recommend? And I think trust is the common ingredient in both of those things. I don't know how, and at the micro level, you can look at how you overcome the problems and kind of, do we deliver on that, and kind of what is the trust that's there. But those two things are utmost important, utmost.
Absolutely, I completely agree, and I would build on that. So maybe that's going to be helpful for the audience, for you. Like you said, I think what you're implying is that we need to educate people. We need to educate employees, but executives, in terms of what NPS is, because they can read the controversial, right? It doesn't measure what it's measuring. It's blah blah blah. But if you really understand the theory behind it, which is it measures loyalty, it doesn't measure customer satisfaction, goes beyond it. It measures loyalty. And then, so what I've done in my work, for example, is identify that, and we measure NPS, but then also identify more tactical things like trust and ease of use and whatever is relevant for a company. And I've done this analysis based on like an enormous sample size of 277,000 ratings. And we predicted Net Promoter and Net Detractor based on the ratings of ease of use, ease of search, personalization, and trust. And guess what? All these statistically significantly predicted whether somebody is a promoter or detractor. But the true insight was the measure of trust was the strongest predictor out of all 4 of these. So
brilliant.
The company always has my best interest as a customer in mind was the strongest predictor. Right. So I think that's goes to, I think Chris wants us to have more of a practical and tactical, like these practical.
Yes.
Yes.
You just measure what is important.
Yeah. I think often it's, NPS is a directional score, can tell you the what, and really the narratives and the stories that come from the customer get you the why. And I think the chasm has always been to connect those 2 points. So really, and getting more predictive, using that as a prescriptive next best action for the customer is where that becomes really practical. So kind of bring
Absolutely.
Yeah, and what's interesting is where you can change the metric to align to future customer behavior. So how confident are you to whatever the action is that you want to take, and then asking them what the barriers are to then predict, okay, if I remove these barriers, that will increase the confidence in the forward direction of the behavior. So I think I totally agree with you. You pick up the Wall Street Journal, you've seen all the LinkedIn pieces about NPS saying, it's the worst thing since, whatever. But I really do believe that it's a great tool if combined in the way that we've just discussed, which is a forward-leaning metric to prescribe what the action should be, and then to actually take the action, which is often the missing ingredient. We're getting into the last 8 minutes. I'm just wondering, if we're then to summarize, so we started with the anchor point, thinking about your customers as people, your anchor point around people first design and people first approach, to then lead us into this point as well. How do you then bring that to life? And you very elegantly brought up and used the analogy of theater, setting the scene for how the experience could be teed up, and then to really use pre-learned ideas to create personality and to think about the persona as an objective element that sits outside the customer, that you're trying to pull them towards key principles. And I would love to maybe just lean into maybe some key takeaways as people who are listening to today's inspirational reflections from you, Donald, as to how they think about what they could do in the next week, in the next month, in the next year to really, I think this idea of the unhappy customer, how do you build trust and win back the unhappy customer, is a really good point. So maybe some key summary points from yourself and Alex in terms of key takeaways for our listeners.
So, Chris, I think you summarized things really well. It's been a great conversation so far. And what I will say as maybe a takeaway, and where the conversation just was, and I talked about NPS, there's macro metrics, but what always remains true, where we started the conversation, is the human condition and theater, and how does an experience feel. What NPS might tell you is a forward-leading, growth-related metric. It doesn't give the why. And Chris, you said it, Alex, I heard it. It doesn't give, so, well, what about? And that is different for many different experiences, for car buying, for airline purchases, for home lending. Like what about that experience made you give it the high score or a low score, or made you neutral? And that level, and that's where I feel like a lot of the controversy is around that metric, because it doesn't give the whole picture. It's a really important metric, but so the closing is constantly interrogate what you know about who you're designing for. What about them? What is most important from a functional and emotional aspect? Because that will help you and help us design better experiences And when things go wrong, what can we do to really make sure that we've made them right? So yeah, high level metrics, great, et cetera. But that unpacking and data can help us. Data can help you predict it. Sometimes it's getting to the point of just, I still, in all these years, I love to hear directly observational kind of, because that's where I get my inspiration to understand the ahas of, okay, if this is who uses our product or this is who we want to buy, what makes them tick? So that, and it's kind of a general point, but I still, the more we can go back to, again, here are the primary drivers, here are the emotional triggers, here's how we can kind of make it right. Then you can influence that macro score, but it won't ever tell you what to do and what to keep doing or what to stop doing. So, and there's new tools, and I know larger data sets will help us predict kind of what do we think are parts, but continue to interrogate that, because that is what I think is customer-led growth. It's looking at how a customer is, what they're doing, what they're feeling, et cetera, that we can design products that really break through overall. And that's one of my, always felt that, always tried to go to that territory, because that's the opportunity and the territory for innovation. Alex, I'd be curious to your thoughts on kind of at least how I summarize, but your years in design and research.
Donald, I have absolutely nothing to add to this brilliant closing. I think it's fantastic, and I think we just need more leaders like you out there. That would be my ad.
And what a wonderful way to end. All I have to do is to thank Donald for your generosity and sharing your wisdom and knowledge that's been built over multiple decades working for some of the world's greatest brands. I always enjoy our conversation. I always come away having learned new things. I saw that in the comments in LinkedIn, certainly resonating with people who attended today. So on behalf of the Trust Podcast, thank you so much, Trust Builders, and look forward to continuing the conversation in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you.
Thank you both. Great conversation. Look forward to the comments and
Excellent.
discussions afterwards. Thank you.
Superb. Thanks again. Take care. Cheers now. Bye-bye.